Leonard Calvert, governor of Maryland, was dying. And so he summoned Brent, his trusted advisor and the most effective lawyer in the colony, and he said, "I am naming you executor of my estate." And then he was gone, leaving Brent to untangle a most perilous chapter in Maryland's 13-year history. And this is how things stood. The last 2 years of Governor Calvert's administration he'd spent putting down the Ingalls Rebellion, a Protestant revolt against the colony's Roman Catholic government. Restoring order had required the services of mercenary soldiers from Virginia. Mercenary soldiers? Anyway, the revolt had been crushed just before Calvert's death. The Catholics controlled Maryland once more, but the mercenaries now had to be paid for their services. The governor's final instructions to his newly appointed executor were actually these 4 words: take all, pay all. Lawyer Brent knew what that meant. Drain Calvert's estate, his personal estate if necessary, but pay the soldiers what was due them. Indeed, a mutiny now would undo everything. But Brent's task would prove more difficult than he had at first imagined, for when the books were opened, it became clear that the former governor's estate didn't even begin to cover the mercenaries' demands. A deft diplomat, Brent first calmed the restless troops, assuring them that they would receive the cash and the food they wanted. Next, since Maryland was then suffering a severe shortage of corn, the attorney procured a sufficient quantity from Virginia to feed the soldiers. And finally, the coup de grace. Brent, poring over the whereases of Governor Calvert's legal situation, discovered that he, Calvert, held the power of attorney to act for his brother. His brother happened to be Lord Baltimore himself, the proprietor of the colony of Maryland. And since Brent, as Calvert's executor, had inherited that power of attorney, and since Lord Baltimore was back in England and not present to protest, Lawyer Brent now had the authority to sell as much of Lord Baltimore's colonial property as was needed to pay Governor Calvert's mercenaries. That accomplished, the soldiers dispersed, and peace returned to Maryland. But then January 21 of 1648, Brent stood before the Maryland Assembly and declared, long story short, "I am Lord Baltimore's attorney. I have cleaned up your mess for you. I'm a colonial landowner myself. I want the right to vote in this assembly." And the assembly said no. Said no. So frustrated and disillusioned, the barrister packed up and left Maryland, never to return. For Brent, the governor's executor, the proprietor's lawyer, the brilliant legal mind and public relations expert, Brent, who finessed Maryland out of a sure disaster, was Margaret Brent. A woman. And as a woman, she could not be permitted to vote in Maryland's assembly, nor anywhere else. American history ought to recognize Margaret Brent for all she did and for all that she was. America's first female attorney, America's first feminist, and so much more. And yet instead she is honored, but only in footnotes, and only for the one failure of her life. And that is, in merely asking for the right to vote, even though she was refused. Margaret Brent is best remembered as America's very first suffragette. But now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Margaret deserves much more than to be, as Mr. Harvey said, just a footnote in history. Because she was a female in a period of male domination, the average person knows very little about her, if they know anything at all. Before hearing this episode, I had never heard of Margaret Brent. So, who was she? Margaret was born in Gloucestershire, England, in about 1601. Regardless of the status of the family, detailed birth records were not recorded as precisely as they are today. And Margaret's family certainly had status. Her father was Sir Richard Brent, Lord of Admington and Larkstark. He was also Sheriff of Gloucestershire. Margaret's mother was Elizabeth Reed, daughter of Edward Reed, Lord of Tewkesbury and Witton. There's no doubt that Margaret and her 12 siblings were from a prominent family. In 1638, for reasons that we can only speculate at, Margaret, her sister Mary, and brothers Giles and Fulk, along with several of their indentured servants, sailed across the North Atlantic Ocean aboard the Elizabeth, up through the Chesapeake Bay, and on November 22nd, 1638, arrived at Maryland's first European settlement and original capital, St. Mary's. The most cited reason for their immigration to Maryland was the series of religious conflicts in England which led to the English Civil War. Today, St. Mary's is a large state-run historic area with several living history museums and a working colonial farm with period-dressed reenactors. I explained in another episode of Paul Harvey's Rest of the Story that I worked as a reenactor at a French fort in the oldest permanent settlement in the Louisiana Purchase. One thing I must say about historical reenactors, they're always studying to ensure that the person they're portraying is as accurate as can be based on the available information. If you missed that episode, I'll leave a link to it in the description. At St. Mary's, you can visit the reconstructed State House where Margaret requested the right to vote. St. Mary's is the fourth oldest permanent English settlement in the United States. St. Mary's is also considered the birthplace of religious freedom in the United States. It was the first colonial settlement with a specific mandate of being a haven for both Catholic and Protestant Christian faiths. Because of Margaret's family's prominent status in England, Margaret and her siblings received large land grants in political offices in Maryland. Folk eventually returned to England. In at least one respect, Maryland was ahead of the times. On October 4th, 1639, Margaret became the first female landowner in Maryland when she received a 70.5-acre land grant. She eventually secured land grants totaling 800 acres and then received another 1,000 acres of land from her brother Giles. Mr. Harvey mentioned Ingles' Rebellion. By the mid-1640s, the English Civil War had spilled over into Maryland. In 1643, Maryland's Governor Leonard Calvert went to England to discuss his policies as governor with his brother Lord Baltimore, who owned thousands of acres in Maryland. While he was away, he left Margaret's brother Giles as acting governor of Maryland. While in England, Governor Calvert married Margaret and Giles' sister Anne. Governor Calvert, Anne, and their newborn son William returned to Maryland in 1644. That same year, William Claiborne, a Virginia trader whose trading post was threatened by Giles Brent's trading post, led an uprising against Giles and Calvert, both of whom were Catholic. Claiborne was a Protestant. In early 1645, Protestant sea captain Richard Ingle, friend and ally of William Claiborne, raided the colony and burned several structures. Governor Calvert was forced to flee, but returned the following year with a large armed force which consisted of the mercenaries Mr. Harvey spoke about. In the summer of 1647, Governor Leonard Calvert contracted an illness and died. In his will, he named Margaret as executor of his estate. On January 24, 1648, Margaret attended the Provincial Assembly. It was then and there that Margaret requested a vote in the council. Governor Calvert's successor, Governor Thomas Greene, denied her request because the assembly privileges, such as a say in the governmental matters, were reserved for queens. After being denied, Margaret said, "I've come to seek a voice in this assembly, and yet because I am a woman, forsooth, I must stand idly by and not even have a voice in the framing of your laws." Forsooth. Now that's a word you don't hear too often. Due to Margaret selling some of Lord Baltimore's property to pay the mercenaries, Lord Baltimore ordered Margaret and the rest of the Brents to leave the Maryland colony altogether. Although the Assembly denied Margaret's request to vote, it sided with her in the case against Lord Baltimore. In a letter to Lord Baltimore dated April 21, 1649, the Assembly wrote that it was better for the colony's safety at that time in her hands than in any man's, for the soldiers would never have treated any others with that civility and respect. By 1650, The Brents had left Maryland and moved to Virginia. Margaret lived on a plantation she called Peace, but she retained ownership of thousands of acres in Maryland. Margaret and her sister Mary never married. Mary died in 1658 at their plantation. Margaret died in about 1671. She also died at peace. That kind of has a nice sound to it. She died at peace. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.